nice to be back here with fellow human beings in the same room. Now, as Alex has already pointed out, the three words in my title sound pretty similar. And what I'd like to do over the next 20 odd minutes is to share my understanding of how they actually differ from each other and how they are dots on the journey that you want to join up in the hope of reaching a desirable destination. My name is Duncan Lawie. I've done a few things in the last 20 odd years, from frontline support to infrastructure work. These days I'm head of technology for a market research and management consulting company. And so that means that I've done most of the back-end jobs and none of the front-end jobs, which is why I think I'm doing the first talk and we have a much more of a front-end person doing the second talk. So what about these words? Digital, digitize, digitalise. Now, I went to my bookshelf to get out a proper dictionary to find out what the meaning of digital was. Now, this is only the first half of the shorter Oxford English Dictionary from 1933. And at that point in time, the word digital was defined as of or pertaining to a finger or to the fingers or digits, 1656, or resembling a finger or the impressions made by one in 1831. So, not really a lot of help. But then I went to the next book on my shelf, the Chambers Dictionary from 1983. And that comes slightly closer because it also adds showing numerical information by a set of digits to be read off instead of a pointer or a dial. Now, I'm only saying these things because I'm sure that everyone here has a pretty clear idea of what they understand digital to mean, and that if you go and look online, which is what any sensible person would do, you'll get something about relating to or being part of a service that provides information expressed in a discrete numerical form. Interestingly, digitise, and for our international friends, there are at least two spellings of digitise. Digitise tends to be also in the dictionary, even from 1983, to put data or put things into a digital form, e.g. for a digital computer. So in 1983 there were other kinds of computers, apparently. But in essence, we generally think about taking a manual process, a physical process, and turning it into a technical or technological process. Now, generally speaking, people look at the word digitalise and they hear the same thing. And most of the definitions that you'll find are the same definition. But I would like to suggest that digitalising is something different. It's not just about taking something and putting it into a technical or a digital form. It's also about thinking about how you use technology, what you can do with technology to actually make your processes different, make your experience different, so that you're supporting humans better. And this might seem a little bit of a radical topic for a technical space, but I actually think that unless we're human-centric in the things we do, we're quite often going to end up going in the wrong direction. So digitalising is about rethinking a process and making sure that it actually works for everybody. And that everybody includes both your customers and your staff, the people outside and inside your process, whatever that means in your organisation. Which is why we tend to come up with this word of digital transformation. It sounds better, digitalise perhaps, and it's got that lovely transformation word in it, which is very important for budgetary purposes. So, and the problem I see with transformation is that it's kind of, it's just the current buzzword. I went to a presentation recently where the main presentation on digital transformation was a company that was taking COBOL and rewriting it in Java. Now, that might be a transformation within digital, but it's not really what I think of as a digital transformation. I found that quite bizarre and maddening. Nevertheless, most of us are already largely in a somewhat digital world. So whatever we're doing, we're going to be taking processes and making them more digital, or working with processes that are somewhat digital today and turning them into new processes that are automating larger or bigger chunks of what we used to do. In fact, I used to have a colleague who hated talking about automation because he was like, we don't do any of the adding up anymore, the computer does that, surely we've already done our automation. But it is much bigger than that. And of course, one of the problems with digital transformation, and the reason that the buzzword will die soon, is that a large proportion of digital transformation efforts fail. In fact, there's the delightful idea here that not only that the reasons that enterprises can't sustain their digital transformation, including not actually seeing returns, organizational structures. 69% of, I was going to say 69% of statistics are made up, but what I've got here is 69% of enterprises consider organizational structure as a barrier. And then if you're not prepared to think about outside the technology space, if you're doing a technology-led digital transformation, it is almost certainly going to fail. And it's interesting to think about, because if we go back to just before the start of my career, I used to read in the computer press about business process re-engineering. BPR was the really cool process from the early 90s. And BPR was probably the process that put all that stuff on the mainframe in the first place. But the thing about business process re-engineering was that it very much talked about efficiency and technology. It made exactly the same mistake of thinking we could solve things just with technology and just by making things supposedly more efficient without thinking about the human elements of the process. So digital transformation fails often. Maybe we should just stop. Maybe we need not bother doing this. But the world is changing, so why should we do this? I mean, the proper consulting answer is probably to say, to keep up with the neighbours. Everybody else is doing it. But for my mind, and in the way that I approach this, it's much more about actually improving the working lives of my colleagues inside and outside the technology department, and indeed making their work with their clients easier. And that kind of view of actually improving the happiness of your organisation feels to me like a great place to start on these kind of conversations. And obviously, I don't have complete control, no one does, and whatever space you're in, you are going to have limits about what you can do and how much you can change. But thinking about the places where you can talk about happiness or job satisfaction, or even just things like people wanting to stay in this job because it's not total crap, those kind of things might be ways that you can talk about and think about how you approach these processes and approach these changes to work on making life better for yourself and your colleagues. Now, I'm sure you've all got processes that you know about that don't work as well as they should. You can probably think about what would look better for you. I want to work through an example that is in my recent experience as a way of talking about this in a bit more detail. Now, once upon a time, people produced reports. You might call it slightly digital if they were using desktop publishing, but that report in a binder that was stuck in the letterbox or walked across the road and delivered to someone or taken in a big suitcase to a conference was the way that information was delivered. So we digitise it. We turn it into a PDF or a PowerPoint or a bunch of charts and graphs. Once upon a time, maybe we would have, no, we wouldn't have. But nevertheless, we would have got to a point where we now have a digital version of this report. What a happy team. Job done. They digitise it. What happens next? Well, now we've got this thing that is easy to copy, easy to share, and we start thinking, well, we can't just email it to people, because they might email it to other people, and we spend a lot of money building this, or it's a lot of reputational value for us, so we want to think about how we manage access to this, to make sure that only the right kind of people see this material. Now, I know that information wants to be free, but I've also heard that information wants to be expensive. And in this particular case, we're thinking about information being valuable and how we control and manage access to that. So we think we'll only do it with registered users. We'll manage that kind of registration process, and then we'll make sure that people are only seeing what they're supposed to see. Now, no one's really thought about this before. So it's all a big hacky manual process to actually give people access. In larger organisations or wide spread out organisations, you're probably going to find that this involves a client in Europe, an account manager in the United States, maybe a techie in India, and therefore it's going to take at least a day, maybe 2 or 3 days to get through this process. And I do say a techie in India because someone has decided that this is a technical process, not a business process, and so they've given it to IT to deal with. And so you kind of get that sorted out, and then the next thing that happens is, oh, we also need to give someone else access. How do we do that? Oh, we didn't really think about this. So we go from that excited team to a pretty clear sense of disappointment, whether you're the client or the business person inside the company, or whether you're the techie who's busy trying to make this stuff go. How do we make this work better? I mean, one of my phrases, and I'm not sure anymore where I got it from, is to think about robot friends. This is not about artificial intelligence replacing us all, and this is not about artificial intelligence being, what's the old line? To err is human, to really screw things up takes a computer. And it's not thinking about that either. It's thinking about how we can get technology, how we can get computers to do the bits that they're good at, and leave the human elements to the humans. And, you know, part of the long process of automation and part of the long process of thinking about how and what technology can do means that over the decades, the capabilities of machines and the capabilities of this technology change. So where we are now, by the time this talk is 2 or 3 years old, I'm sure the technology will have moved on and we might be thinking quite differently about our robot friends. But hopefully they're still friendly. So if we're going to think about this kind of process, firstly we need to understand what the process is. And, you know, drawing out that process flow, we could talk about, I could diverge into talking about value stream mapping for 20 or 30 minutes. And if you're not familiar with that, I do recommend having a look at value stream mapping and how you think about where the value is in your process and the things you can take out of it. But in something like this, I'm going to shortcut that process. So we have a process here where the accounts team gets the funds into the account. They hand it over to the sales manager to say that's done. The sales manager gives it to the operational team, who then has several steps that they need to complete. They then go and ask the user to prove who they are or something like that. The user probably needs to hand this information back. If it's gone into their spam folder, it might get lost for days. You end up having a Teams meeting, a phone meeting, the sales manager pings them on WhatsApp. Eventually you manage to get that access sorted out. And then the user finally gets access. So we know what the process is. Why don't we automate it? We know we can just automate this manual process and turn it into something new. But that doesn't really necessarily help us. As I was saying before, if we think about what we actually want from this process and what the humans want from this process, we could end up in quite a different place. And so if we redesign the process and we think about automation, and in this particular case I've chosen to leave the sales person in there to contact the user, because this is an element of human touch and making sure that the person who is actually paid for this product understands and feels like they have some related contact back with the human, back with the person who originally sold it to them. And then the user has a self-service capability, which means that now they can take a link, they can fill in a form. Once they've completed that form, they immediately have access to the product. And so you're taking the place where you're moving all of those manual processes out of the path, and you're putting them in a place instead where the operational team now are in the background in case the technology breaks, in case your technical solution fails, but they're no longer part of what is needed to actually get the user their access. So I mean, this is a very simple example on the whole, but it does actually make life better in terms of both the user experience and the internal organization experience. And there are 3 key elements in this: integration, automation, and security. So in terms of integration, you know, I mentioned earlier we talk about automation and the old building blocks we had. We would have once thought about the account system as a completely independent environment that only the treasury team have access to. If we have a hacker in the house, we want to make sure that they don't get anywhere near that kind of critical environment. And in fact, we probably don't want most of our staff to see what anyone else gets paid in another country. So, but we do, in these kind of instances, want to think about what the borders are and how we can use stuff to do things differently. So building an application programming interface, an API, between that accounting system and the system that manages user access means that we can now automate this process, and the user management system can then be built in a way that it takes information from accounting and it builds the necessary access configurations and then hands that off either directly to the user or, in my preferred example, to the sales manager, so the sales manager can then contact the user. Or you could alternatively and most likely send a message to both of them so that the account consumer can directly consume it, but has a salesperson they can contact. And the salesperson, again, is probably someone they already know rather than a stranger in the back room who is much more likely to be ignored. And so I've already mentioned automation fairly, probably about 20 times so far in what I've said. But that's that's one of the things that is actually probably much more fun than doing those manual processes, and is something that is much more rewarding as a piece of your work, and gives you the opportunity to do non-repetitive, interesting exercises. And indeed, security. I mean, I mentioned how the accounting system works, or people's concerns about accounting. But security is equally important for managing that access, for enabling your consumer to identify themselves. So using things like single sign-on has made a massive difference, and is one that would have been unthought of 10 or 15 years ago, where you would have had to create a separate password for every place you go. These days, so many of our organizations across the world use a relatively small number of single sign-on solutions, and you can therefore integrate with those directly and solve for 80 or 90% of your users quite simply. So now our team's really happy, at least guys in this photo are. And you know what difference has it made? In this particular example, we've had days of elapsed time cut off the process because you're no longer running around the world electronically to try and find the right person to solve your problem. And that avoiding all of those handovers, and indeed, automating a 12-hour process into 12 minutes is lovely, but if it's still got a 24-hour handover time, you haven't solved the biggest problem in what you're doing. But maybe that's wandering back into the value stream mapping question and thinking about where the real benefit is in the work that you're trying to do. It also puts you in a place where those sales teams have more ownership. They can do the things that they need to do themselves. They don't feel dependent on a backroom person, and the backroom person doesn't suffer the kind of pressure of a salesperson in another region whose commission is dependent on the user actually getting this stuff. And indeed, the operational team gets to do, I was going to say more interesting things, but troubleshooting is sometimes not more interesting. But on the whole, they get to do more interesting things, automating, getting away from manual processes, doing other things that are more fun. And it does open the door for further ongoing improvements. I mentioned that we use the technology we have available to us today. As that changes, we can do other things. We can build this into larger automations potentially. Or we can think about the use cases that we already have with the data we've collected. Now we know who our users are, and now we can see perhaps more about what they're doing, and we can work with our sales teams. For example, they can see who is actually logging in and maybe focus their sales efforts differently. Or we can see that a product is no longer being used, and we can decommission it. So, in conclusion, the term that everybody loves to hear, as long as the speaker only gives it once, we already live in a largely digital world. And most of the time, when you've got a digital process that's frustrating or painful, it's a pretty good indication that it's a digital process, a digitized process, rather than a digitalized process. And the essence of thinking about how we make sure our processes actually work for us and support the products we have is critical to the work that we should be doing now to make our own work and our lives and our colleagues happier. Thank you. Over to you.